You know, we're getting on in the semester because we've reached the last of the three major Bretton Woods institutions. Today we're talking about the World Bank. So we've covered the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which evolved into the World Trade Organization. We've covered the International Monetary Fund, and now we're talking about the World Bank. And we're talking about the World Bank right now, sort of having done a couple of class sessions on foreign aid, with implicitly a focus on bilateral aid from government to government and aid from non-governmental organizations. So now we're talking about multilateral aid, right? Coordinated through the World Bank. And the World Bank sort of not being the only multilateral aid organization by a long shot in the world, multilateral meaning multiple countries coordinating together, but being sort of the largest and the most prominent multilateral aid organization. And one of the things that we'll actually talk about in our class session, on the World Bank is sort of China's answer to the World Bank, which is sort of the Asian Infrastructure and Development Bank, which is intended to be an alternative source of development capital to the World Bank that follows kind of a different set of rules, a different set of political priorities. So we'll talk about kind of today in this lecture, I'm mostly focusing on kind of how the World Bank operates and implicitly kind of focusing on the part of history which was most of the 20th century the second half of the 20th century when the World Bank was kind of the only game in town for multilateral development aid, or certainly by far the biggest game in town. And that landscape is becoming a little more heterogeneous now, a little more, there are a few more alternative sources of capital out there. So we'll sort of talk about how that is changing the playing field a little bit. But okay. So in some sense, we might expect the World Bank to be the least controversial of the Bretton Woods institutions, right? The goal of the World Bank is to reduce global poverty. Who could be opposed to that, right? Everybody must love the World Bank, right? But it is one of those Bretton Woods institutions. It was founded in the early days of the Cold War, and it played a Cold War role throughout the second half of the 20th century, right? Until the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so its goal was to reduce global poverty, but through capitalist means, right? Through free market means. So part of their mandate, in addition to alleviating global poverty, is to promote foreign investment, to promote free trade, to promote private capital investment in the countries in which they're operating, right? So it's not just reduce poverty, but reduce poverty in this particular way. And so the primary sort of poverty fighting tools that the World Bank is deploying are financial grants, so chunks of money that don't have to be paid back, no interest or low interest loans, and both of those are kind of made to governments. We talked about kind of the going around governments versus going through governments kind of path on foreign aid, and the World Bank goes through governments, right? Gives money to governments on projects that the World Bank helps design, right? And they're early, there was a really nice video that I assigned you to watch, and strongly encourage that you watch this interview with a financial journalist who sort of talks about the history of the World Bank going through different stages, sort of what were they up to in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, the 80s, kind of decade by decade, how their approach to development evolved, and talking how they started with big infrastructure projects, then started to feed in education and health, then started to look more at macroeconomic policy and so on. They still do big infrastructure projects. We'll be talking about some specific World Bank projects in our in-class session, one of which is a large dam project, and another one of which is like a land titling program where they collaborate with the government to help establish who owns what piece of land. So a lot of land surveying and recording of titles. Okay. So in addition to sort of lending money and giving money to fund development projects, the World Bank also has an insurance arm, right, where they're providing investment insurance and loans to private investors to bring private capital in, because remember, that's part of their mandate is to get private capital coming in. So they're coming in with some subsidized capital or free capital for infrastructure investment, but they're also trying to stimulate investment by private investors. One of the ways they do that is to provide political risk insurance. So to provide insurance policies where if the national government just takes your stuff, the World Bank will pay back the private firm for their losses, right? So that helps incentivize private firms to go into places that might seem too risky otherwise. And they also do a lot of, in terms of running these bodies that resolve disputes between governments and foreign investors, right? And in the foreign investment section of the class, we talked about how controversial sort of that can be, and the fact that these investor-state dispute resolution mechanisms sometimes end up finding in favor of firms and forcing governments to pay large sums of money to firms that feel they've been harmed by government policies. So the World Bank is kind of deep into things that are related to the scope of sovereignty that developing countries have in managing, and developed countries as well. This is most controversial with developing countries, but the scope of sovereignty that national governments have in managing their relationships with foreign investors. So the World Bank does get sort of deep into the weeds on that. Okay. The World Bank is also a bit of a development brain trust. It's a really exciting group of economists, and they have a fair number of political scientists and sociologists and anthropologists working for them as well. And full disclosure, when I was a doctoral student, I worked as a research assistant for a scholar at the World Bank. So they've got this big research arm, fancy building in Washington, D.C., near the George Washington University campus. And they develop a lot of best practices about how to go about foreign aid and economic development projects, right? They do a lot of research on kind of what works in economic development. And then they educate both national governments and NGOs about those best practices, right? So. And then the World Bank also collects and disseminates a lot of data, right? So we talked about the IMF doing a lot of this, the International Monetary Fund doing a lot of this. Well, the World Bank does a lot of this too. They produce the World Development Indicators, which is sort of the largest, most easily accessible kind of country year data on things like maternal health and child mortality and literacy rates and economic inequality and the share of the population that has access to clean water or access to reliable power or access to renewable power, all of these sorts of things. Hundreds of variables the World Bank sort of collects and disseminates. They have a database of political institutions, world governance indicators, the doing business indicators that we talked about quite a bit in a previous lecture, right? So they collect and disseminate these data, many of which kind of, particularly things like the doing business indicators, really shape government policy and really sort of set goals and targets and have a lot to do with influencing how governments approach management of their economy. I had mentioned in a previous lecture that governments pay attention to these doing business indicators and then go ahead and produce advertisements like for CNN International where they promote how well they're doing. So I did grab, unfortunately, I couldn't find one of the Sports Center themed ads that I really liked that Georgia had put together, but I was able to find this one that the Georgian government had put together targeted at potential foreign investors. And I thought it was fun enough to be worth kind of including in here. Right. So, so they're celebrating an anti-corruption rating that comes from Transparency International, which is an NGO, but they're also celebrating kind of how much they've moved up through the rankings on the doing business indicators, right? And trying to use that improvement as a selling point with foreign investors, saying, come do business here. It's a good place to do business. So if the World Bank is, collecting data and building government capacity and giving lots of loans for development projects, they should be super popular, right? How is it a bad idea to be an agency that's trying to solve global poverty, right? But it has been a controversial organization and continues to be, right? And so what I'm going to do in the next portion of the lecture, and really for most of the rest of this lecture, is kind of run through what are the different criticisms of the World Bank. So let's kind of go through this litany, right? So one of the things that's going on here is that, the World Bank is criticized for, hey, look, that part of the 50 years is enough campaign, which came around, the 50th anniversary of the World Bank in the late 90s, was, look, you've been doing this for 50 years. If you haven't been successful yet, in some respects, we've talked about how much harder how much less successful the world has been in terms of using foreign aid to generate economic development than it has been with respect to foreign aid and public health. And actually, if you go to the World Bank headquarters, there is a statue to commemorate the end, sort of the global eradication of river blindness, right? Which was a disease that used to leave a lot of people blind and has been successfully eradicated from the world with quite a bit of funding from the World Bank. And so in some sense, like, one of the successes they're most proud of is a public health success, right? They have fewer and less prominent sort of successes to point to in terms of, like, hey, here's how we used foreign aid to economically transform this country, right? Like, that's been much harder. And so the idea is, like, look, so some of the criticism is, if you've been doing this for 50 years and you don't have, and now 70 years, and you don't have a lot of success to point to in terms of generating transformative economic development, maybe you should just give up and go home. And the defense from the World Bank would be something along the lines of, like, look, poverty reduction is really hard, and our resources aren't that large relative to the scope of the problem. So, like, we've made a lot of progress on things, we've had a positive impact, like, give us a break, would be kind of the defense, right? But also, as was noted in the interview sort of video that I had you watch, they've changed their approach over the decades, right? So they started out with a large focus on big infrastructure projects, especially dams, which makes sense. You need a reliable source of electricity if you're going to industrialize. And hydroelectric power is very cheap once the dam is built. It's clean. So there's a lot of environmental damage around the drowning of an entire valley, and there's disruption of migratory fish, but there's not a lot of air pollution. There's not any air pollution, right? So hydropower can be excellent for development. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest in the United States, where pretty much all the power is hydro. But those big infrastructure projects weren't enough to generate development. So they switched some of their focus to health and education projects. And again, they had some major successes in the health area. But then they still weren't getting the economic growth they were hoping to see after their projects. And so then they were trying to address macroeconomic policy. And then that gets them sort of into this domain of structural adjustment, working alongside the IMF. And that's super controversial vis-a-vis sovereignty. And then you get into sort of the domestic political institutions at the national government and local government level that are sort of causing the bad policy. And if you get into shaping governance institutions, then you're really messing with sovereignty, right? So, the World Bank has been pretty controversial in terms of doing the simple stuff, like, and the less controversial stuff, like the health interventions, isn't enough to generate economic growth. And as you get into the things that you think might be enough, now you're getting stuff that's highly controversial around sovereignty and economic policy, and things get to be a bit of a mess. Okay. So as the World Bank has gotten involved in questions about what macroeconomic policy should be, and even sort of what tax rates should be and what regulations should look like and that sort of thing, and pushing for economic openness, this creates winners and losers, right? And starts to mess with sovereignty, right? In terms of, if you've got a population that prefers, a much more left or left-wing approach to economic policy, and you've got sort of the economists, the World Bank, pushing a much more free market policy, then you have the preferences of citizens at odds with the preference of this large, unaccountable international organization, and some real concerns about what that's doing to democracy. Okay, and then especially prior to the late 90s, the World Bank got a lot of criticism for not paying that much attention to the environment. This particularly in relation to a lot of the large infrastructure projects they were pushing, where there was sort of an implicit ideology at the World Bank that environmental protection was a bit of a luxury good. You had to make sure people weren't starving to death before you started to worry about clean air and clean water and some of these things. Like, it was okay to, sort of drown a valley and endanger some species if that meant having electricity that allowed industrialization, that allowed people to rise up out of extreme poverty, right? That there was sort of a kind of a hierarchy of needs kind of implicitly built in here, that like, we're not going to pay too much. We're not going to worry too much about the environment. We're going to get development done. And they got a lot of flack for that, right? And so, and as, and World Bank policy has changed, there are a lot more environmental safeguards around World Bank projects than there used to be, right? But a lot of these started to come about after some of the criticism that they were experiencing, right? And I want to sort of speak here, circle back to something that we've talked about before, because I do want to always be connecting sort of issues that we're talking about that are specific to a particular institution or something like that to these broader social science concepts. And I really want to sort of talk about the concept of externalities, which are really, really important here, because that's the way, that's sort of the intellectual superstructure to put around kind of environmental harm in an economic context, is to think about environmental harm as a negative externality. So there's some economic transaction that's taking place. For example, a transaction between a firm that's buying power to run all of its factory equipment and the dam company, the electric company that's generating the power and transmitting it across the electric lines. There's a transaction that's going on there, but there's an externality that is suffered by all the people upriver from the dam or downstream from the dam that have had their livelihoods ruined because fish stocks were destroyed, or had their whole lives displaced because the village they used to live in is now underwater. So those harms are externalities. And similarly, if the factory that's getting the electricity from this dam is throwing off a bunch of air pollution, right? There's a transaction between the factory that's producing, microwave ovens and the people who are buying the microwaves. And so there's this transaction, but external to that, not part of the transaction, are all the people who are living near the factory who are breathing this terrible air, right? And so laissez-faire economics says, look, markets are going to be really efficient at deciding how many factories should be built and how many microwave ovens should be manufactured in those factories, because there's all this information in prices that tells the factory owner sort of how to behave in an optimal and efficient way. That is true if and only if there are zero externalities, right? Negative or positive, that there are zero externalities. If there are externalities, the free market doesn't price those in. A government actually has to intervene and price those in. And so any time that an economic activity produces either a positive benefit that's not captured by the seller, or a negative benefit that is, a negative cost that isn't paid by the producer, anytime either of those things is true, unless there is government intervention, you will have an inefficient outcome. Right? But that notion that laissez-faire economics means leaving markets alone except to deal with externalities often gets reduced to simply leave markets alone, right? And sort of, there's been a lot of discussion lately about shareholder supremacy and about whether firms should focus exclusively on making profits, or whether they should take more of a stakeholder model where they're trying to meet the needs of a variety of stakeholders, including their workers, people who live in their community, et cetera, right? And the defense of sort of shareholder primacy and the idea that firms should exclusively focus on profits, the most influential statement of that was made by Milton Friedman in sort of a popular article written in the early 70s, I think in Time magazine, actually. They'll have to double check the source on that, where he said, like, look, the most moral thing for business to do is focus narrowly on maximizing profits. But again, what's sort of lost from the argument he made there is there's a big if there, which is that's the way businesses should behave if governments are actively working to price in externalities. if all the externalities are priced in, then governments can focus narrowly on making profits, and all the things that they need to consider for social welfare are showing up in the price. And so they can just be focused on profits and everything will turn out in a pretty socially optimal way. But that's a really big if, and we've kind of lost that. If you have a government that's not actively intervening to address externalities, and firms behave in a way that only pays attention to profits, we're going to end up in a really socially suboptimal situation with too much environmental damage and so on and so forth. So I just, I want to focus your attention on thinking about where do externalities exist and what is the government doing to address them? And then the other piece that I want to say is that it's not quite as simple as saying, okay, if there's an externality, then the government just addresses it. Right? Because externalities are really hard to address. They're really hard to price in. And sometimes when the government intervenes in the market to address an externality, the outcome is not actually pure efficiency, right? Like it's not, oh, there's an externality, any intervention we do will be fine. Getting that intervention right is really, really hard. And one of the areas where sort of more libertarian sort of folks versus more left, sort of economically left of center folks tend to disagree is how much we should trust the government to get that intervention right. How good is the government at intervening to address an externality, and how efficient is the outcome when the government does do that? So even if we can get agreement that it's inefficient for no intervention to take place, figuring out how good of an intervention we can expect and what types of intervention should be attempted is then its whole own area of debate. But I at least want to get us as far today as thinking about free markets are optimal and efficient if and only if all externalities are priced in. Negative externalities, think about pollution. That's sort of a great archetype there. Positive externalities, sort of think about education, where if you get your education, it benefits you individually. So let's say you pay money and you attend USC, you get your USC degree, right? You reap a lot of the economic benefits of that, but society also reaps some benefits that you don't claim. Right? Because you are more economically productive with your degree, you may make some innovative discoveries that produce technology that benefits lots of other people. You will pay a lot of taxes in your lifetime because you are making so much money, and that tax money will fund other things, right? So there are a lot of, you will be a more informed and hopefully active citizen engaged in democratic governance with your USC degree. That should have positive benefits beyond you, right? So the idea is that education has a bunch of positive externalities where, yes, you as the individual purchasing the education will consume some of the value, but there's additional value beyond that that is consumed by people other than you. And so if we don't subsidize education, then we'll underproduce it, right? So if we don't regulate and tax environmental harm, we'll get too much pollution. And if we don't subsidize things like education, we'll get too little of them. So positive externalities, you need to subsidize or you'll get too little. And negative externalities, you need to regulate or tax or you will get too much. Okay. So that's sort of a revisiting of externalities embedded in this World Bank lecture. Whew. Moving ahead. So another critique of the World Bank is one that's common to critiques of international institutions. It's common to a critique of the European Union, of the UN, of the IMF, right? Which is that the World Bank is unaccountable to some of the citizens which it serves. In particular, the World Bank is supposed to be alleviating poverty, but it's unaccountable to the poor, right? So like the IMF, the World Bank was created by rich countries. It's accountable to those rich countries. The same sort of a quota system that determines control of the IMF works in the World Bank. The countries that put up the money get to determine where those loans go and how those loans are prioritized and all that sort of thing. And it's also the case that, remember, baked into the World Bank's mission is not just alleviating poverty, but also doing it in a very particular way of sort of promoting free trade, promoting foreign investment. And they even have this whole arm devoted to investor-state dispute resolution and political risk insurance and all that kind of stuff that's very specific and aggressively sort of promoting foreign investment, right? And there's an argument that the foreign investment and the trade that they're promoting may be helping investors more than those investment receiving countries, that it may not actually be doing a lot on the, it may not always be doing a lot on the poverty alleviation front, and maybe a lot of those gains are actually going to the investing countries and not to those receiving the investment and the developing countries participating in that trade. So there's, so there are critiques around to whom the World Bank is accountable. And we engaged in this in quite a bit of depth with the International Monetary Fund. And I just want to sort of point to the fact that the exact same issues are at play here with the World Bank. Okay. And then, the World Bank is coming in to fund a bunch of development projects, right? And sometimes they're funding them with grants, but often they're funding them with loans. And even no interest loans, even interest-free loans, can be hard to pay back. You still have to pay back the principal, right? And governments in poor countries are generally weak, in terms of being relatively low capacity, because they don't, if the country is poor, then there isn't a ton of tax revenue to fund this huge, super capable government, right? And then corruption is frequently a problem, right? And so working through a developing country government is inevitably going to, and indeed working through any government, right? I don't care whether it's Switzerland, is going to involve some waste and corruption, right? And so just pointing back to that rock and a hard place kind of aspect of our foreign aid lectures, right? The World Bank has chosen its path. It goes through governments, but that's going to mean some World Bank funds get wasted. And if World Bank funds come into a country, and let's say it's a dam project, right? And a bunch of funds come in from the bank in the form of a low interest or no interest loan to build this dam, but half that money gets siphoned off by corrupt officials. It's not like the government, the citizens, the taxpayers of that country are only on the hook to pay back the half of the World Bank funds that actually went to building the dam. They're on the hook to pay back all of the World Bank funds, including those that got siphoned off by corrupt officials and ended up on the French Riviera, right? So, there's a justice problem there, that if the World Bank isn't doing enough to address corruption in the projects that they're funding, and indeed, per sort of the critiques of Dambisa Moyo and others, if the fact that there's this big flood of World Bank money coming into the country is actually creating that corruption, and now you've got citizens in the country that received that low interest loan on the hook to pay it back, even though half of that loan didn't even go to a development project, it got siphoned off. That's problematic, right? That's not okay. Okay. So, the World Bank, we've talked about how, addressing governance issues. The whole reason I became a political economist as opposed to just an economist is my view that the quality of governance is fundamental to generating economic growth, and poor governance is a fundamental explanation for poverty globally, right? And when it comes to governance, building capacity is the relatively easy part, right? It's slow, it's difficult, it's painstaking, but it's fairly uncontroversial. So when the World Bank, say, funds a land titling program where they are going to go in and they're going to help a government develop the capacity to survey all the land, all of their territory, figure out which smallholder farmer owns which piece and exactly where the boundaries of their land are, and issue a formal title to that individual such that they can use that title to back a loan, or so that they can sell the land effectively to somebody else, and so that nobody can sort of come in and displace them off their land. Establishing the bureaucracy to do that takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of training, and it takes a lot of effort, but it's not super controversial. But if we're going to try to address corruption and accountability, if we say, hey, look, it's a big problem to come in here with a big pot of money for development projects and then not really manage the corruption, okay, if that's super problematic, it's also problematic when you start coming in from the outside and trying to address corruption and trying to regulate the behavior of public officials in another country. So when you're trying to mandate clean governance and democratic accountability from the outside, there's an inherent paradox there. Democracy promotion from the outside is inherently a paradox, right? Because the whole notion of democracy is that a government should be accountable to its citizens. If you're making the government accountable to the World Bank, that's not democracy, right? Okay. that is where we'll end today. So thank you for being with me. And yeah, when we meet in person, we're going to talk through a couple of specific World Bank projects and kind of the controversies that have come up around them, and talk about like, well, what could the World Bank do better? Some of the viewing for this week is a couple of animated explainer videos that come out of the Security and Political Economy Lab and it's a research project that I spent quite a few years working on. And this is related to human rights accountability at the World Bank. And so we'll be discussing that in our in-person sessions as well. And I'm very much looking forward to that. Thank you all.